So much emotion is delivered in these few seconds that we have through the combination of the cinematography, the editing, and not to mention the score, the music that builds up to this really satisfying moment for any Game of Thrones fan, alright? It makes you swell up, it's incredible, and this is all done with so little dialogue. There's nothing is said, alright, to convey this information. It doesn't treat the audience like dummies by saying a bunch of expository lines of dialogue, being like, oh, Jon Snow is Aegon Targaryen. No, it's all subtle, alright? And that's when Game of Thrones is at its one of its best, alright? Season 6 still has some weak writing, but I think is a great season overall, because of moments like this that really get you all amped. I still think Game of Thrones excels in everything to do with production value, the editing, cinematography. However, the writing has been bad for years now, alright? It is just terrible, alright? So this shows that no matter how big your special effects are, no matter how, much money you're putting into this, no matter who's composing, the scores, if your writing is fundamentally broken, it's gonna kill your show, alright? And this is where we were up to Game of Thrones right now, Season 8, Episode 3, The Battle for Winterfell. And oh boy, I don't think this episode is necessarily bad, but just because of the production value going into it, but I still think this episode is not good in terms of the payoff it has for this, 8-year-long, 9-year-long, arc that's been going on since there was a break when Game of Thrones was off for a year. So yeah, 9 years this has been building up in the show, and it's got so little payoff. It's just so disappointing. And I mean, the Night King, what was his point, alright? He's saying, oh, this is the long night, this is the episode where, the North is going to be taken over, the White Walkers are going to invade everything, turn everything to ice. But we're still wondering why? Why do they want to do this? It makes no sense whatsoever. The Night King is not a character, he's just this villain that just wants to turn everything down. He has no personality whatsoever. He's a really terrible villain, alright? And in the same practically weekend that, this episode was released, we also got Avengers Endgame release, in which it's so much more satisfying in how it resolves character arcs and everything. So yeah, spoiler alert for both of them, by the way, if you didn't already get the memo. But yeah, as someone who saw the first Iron Man as a little boy, it's so satisfying seeing all these arcs come to full circle. You see Tony Stark, who starts out as a cocky billionaire, coming up to be someone who's actually going to be willing to sacrifice his life for the whole universe. And also Captain America's arc also wraps up really nicely, although I'm not as big of a Captain America fan as I am an Iron Man fan, but still, it's satisfying to see those arcs, be fulfilled. I did not feel the same with Game of Thrones, right? And this is a show that I'm actually more invested in Game of Thrones than I am in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I absolutely love this world of A Song of Ice and Fire, right? I think it's brilliant. But when, the writer gets off the books, D&D, when they're off the books, it just becomes subpar, mediocre, to then sometimes just being terrible, like the Sand Snakes plot in Dawn. Christ.
You want a good girl, but you need a bad pussy.
And I was just talking about the Night King earlier on. Thanos has better character development than the Night King, alright? A Marvel villain. Alright, Marvel villains usually suck, and usually like Game of Thrones, you got these complex, intricate characters, but no, Thanos turns out to be more complex than the Night King. That's just a reversal, and I mean, even in Avengers Endgame, I think there's more Starks that die in Avengers Endgame than there is in Game of Thrones. Alright, I felt much more consequences, much more stakes in Endgame than I did for this episode, because at first you're like, oh, all these people, they got, whites all around them, then they get saved, and then sometimes a less important character will sacrifice himself for this bigger, important character, and they repeat that twice or 3 times in this episode, and it's ridiculous how much plot armor everyone has. In Endgame, there's a bit of that, right? A bit of contrivances in the narrative and the screenplay, and how, wait a second, how is that character still alive? The thing is, I'm tending to, I'm willing to accept that kind of stuff in the Marvel Cinematic Universe more often than I am for Game of Thrones, because the thing is with the Marvel Cinematic Universe is it tends to be much more sillier, I guess, than Game of Thrones, for example, where Game of Thrones has always been, grounded in realism, so some things I can, kind of look past in the MCU, I can't in Game of Thrones, because you already established your rules in this universe that there are consequences to everything. Here there are no consequences. Consequences, they just don't matter. And that is insane, alright? That is why I can't forgive some, mistakes, plot holes, battle strategies when I'm, meant to be like, alright, this is Game of Thrones, this is kind of like a realistic fantasy setting, alright, so even if it is fantasy, it still has its own rules and it's still grounded in its realism, but that's all thrown away through plot hole, battle strategies that don't make any sense, even Arya Stark just kind of teleporting out of nowhere, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, yeah, I get, she has trained in the prior, 6 seasons before, but still, there is no chance she could have sneaked past this entire army of the dead. Like, she even, bruised her head earlier on in the episodes, like, oh no, I'm damaged. So that makes no sense. Like, the only props I can really give this episode is not the writing, that's for sure. But I'd probably say the director. I know a lot of people are kind of arguing about the cinematography in this episode, how dark it is. I'm probably one of the few that didn't mind that too much. Like, I felt like there was plenty of ways that you could see through, Melisandre lighting, the fires. I thought, oh yeah, that's kind of clear. Like, sure, things are a bit chaotic looking, but I didn't really mind that too much. I guess it all depends on how you watch the show. If you like streaming it, then it might be a bit blurry, so you kind of get like a bunch of pixels. But yeah, I think my problem with, Endgame's fight scene is probably how messy that entire sequence is towards the end, where every hero comes in, because then it feels like it's, much more messy. It's not as tight as it was before with the 3 heroes for, Iron Man, Captain America against Thanos. It was very kind of laser focused, that fight sequence, and how it's directed. And things with the Russo brothers, I think they can direct much more smaller fights way better, like just with a few characters, for example. Not that the fight is small, it is, still a pretty big fight in terms of its scale, but when they're dealing with a bunch of characters, it just gets really messy. This is even seen in Infinity War and the Battle of Wakanda, where there's just a bunch of CGI monsters everywhere and a bunch of heroes, and it just looks ugly. And the cinematography in Infinity War, I think, is still good, but whenever they're on Earth, it's bad looking. But I will say everything is visually striking in Endgame than it is in Game of Thrones. But then again, I don't mind that as much. However, I do have a problem with the darkness involved with the dragons, because I could barely tell what was going on with the dragons when they're up in the fog. So yeah, I'd say that the criticisms with, the cinematography in the episode is pretty valid in, some parts. But yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of problems here. Deaths are very predictable, they're very telegraphed. Game of Thrones and Endgame. The deaths are pretty predictable, because you're like, okay, these actors is on, contracts. These actors' contracts are going to end at some point, and they're going to end during this movie. So you can kind of tell, but even then I felt like there was more oh shit moments in Endgame than there was in Game of Thrones, which is just very strange that we got, that treatment. The only crazy thing that happened was Arya Stark killing the Night King. That felt like a Star Wars The Last Jedi moment, where they're like, subverting your expectations, but doing it because it would shock you, not that it would make any sense. Like, I just think the hack writers, David and Dan, are just not good writers, because they just don't understand the point of Game of Thrones. When characters like Ned Stark and Robb Stark died, there was purpose to their deaths. It didn't just happen because, it'd be shocking, alright? Shows like The Walking Dead do that. They kill off their characters because either their ratings are low or actors want out, or they're like, why not? Something exciting needs to happen. Like, Game of Thrones always killed off characters for a reason. There was always purpose. You could always trace a point back to why a character died. Like Robb Stark, if you rewatch season 3, there are so many moments leading to his death that when you get to his death scene in the Red Wedding, it's tragic, but it makes sense, and that's why it's so rewarding to finally pick out those points when you go back to the beginning of the season. But Christ, that is just, it's not there anymore. They just decide, we'll do shocking stuff because why not? I mean, they try to make it seem like, oh yeah, we set up Arya killing off the Night King with a, dialogue between Melisandre and her. And it's just like, that's a tenuous link. It feels very, retconned, just because they put the blue eyes afterwards in this new scene to kind of emphasize it where it wasn't emphasized before. So yeah, that link is very tenuous, and yeah, it's very disappointing. I don't think this episode ruined Game of Thrones, because honestly, it has been like this for a while, the writing-wise. But yeah, I still yearn for the old, classic, politic-based Game of Thrones. Because now the writing is just terrible, right? They're not going to handle Cersei well, but yeah, I guess that's everything I have to say.